Some towns don't announce themselves. They simply appear around a bend in a county road. A grain elevator, a water tower, a church steeple, a cluster of houses and businesses that have grown up together over 100 years the way trees grow in a grove, each one shaped by the presence of the others. Calhoun Bend, Iowa, was that kind of town. Population 800 and something in a good year. More on a Sunday, when the farm families drove in from the outlying sections for church and the weekly ritual of coffee and gossip at Millard's Diner, where the pie was excellent and the coffee came in a pot that never quite emptied. Abner Krause had been eating breakfast at Millard's 5 mornings a week for the better part of 3 decades. He was 61 years old in the summer of 1993, a lean man whose hands told his whole biography. Thick-knuckled, permanently stained at the joints with the ghost of engine grease, calloused across the palms from wrench handles and fence pliers and the 1,000 other tools of farm demands. He wore the same uniform year-round, canvas work pants, a chambray shirt worn soft at the elbows, and a John Deere cap that had been green once and was now a colorless state somewhere between khaki and memory. He drove a 1978 Ford F-250 with a cracked dashboard and a heater that still worked, which in Iowa counted as nearly new. He didn't talk much at Millard's. He drank black coffee, ate 2 eggs over easy with white toast, and listened to the radio on the wall above the pie case. WSM out of Nashville came in clear enough on the AM dial when the weather cooperated, and Abner liked the farm reports that ran early in the morning, commodity prices, precipitation forecasts, the particular language of agriculture that reminded him he was part of something larger than his own 240 acres. People in Calhoun Bend knew a few things about Abner Krause without being told. They knew he had served in Vietnam, came back in 1969 without talking about it, and had been fixing engines for people ever since in a manner that suggested he found machines more straightforward than human beings. They knew he had never married, though there had been a woman named Ruth Hennessy once, years ago, and the county had watched that story with the quiet, respectful attention it gave to things that mattered and then didn't. They knew that Abner's farm was not the most profitable operation in the county, and that he did not seem troubled by this. He grew winter wheat on his rolling ground, and kept a few acres of soybeans down in the creek bottom. And in between farming, he fixed tractors and combines and grain augers and diesel engines for half the county at rates that had not changed much since 1979. And they knew about the thing in the barn. Most people in Calhoun Bend had heard about it the way you hear about things in small towns, not because anyone announced it, but because knowledge seeps through communities the way water seeps through limestone, slowly and completely, finding every crack. The story was that Abner's father, Earl Krause, had built something out in the machine shed back in the late 1950s. Something peculiar. Something that made the neighboring farmers shake their heads when they saw it, and then made them laugh, and then made them forget about it entirely, because by the time Earl finished it, the world had moved on to bigger and faster machines, and nobody much cared about what a returning Marine with too much time and too many war surplus parts had bolted together in a drafty Iowa machine shed. It had been sitting in that barn ever since. Nobody thought about it much anymore. Until June of 1993. The sign on the door of the old Peterson implement dealership had changed 3 times in 8 years, which in itself told you something about the times. What had been Peterson's John Deere for 42 years became Tri-County AG Solutions in 1987, when old Harlan Peterson took the buyout that the farm crisis had made impossible to refuse. Then Tri-County was absorbed by Consolidated Agricultural Services in 1990. And then in early 1993, CAS was acquired by AgriCorp Midwest, which sent a district manager named Calvin Tremblay to run the operation out of the old Peterson building. Calvin was 34 years old, wore khaki slacks and company polo shirts, and carried a business degree from the University of Iowa, along with a philosophy of agricultural efficiency that he was glad to explain to anyone who stood still long enough to hear it. He had grown up in Cedar Rapids, which was a fine city, but not a farming community, and what he knew about farming he had learned in classrooms and in the company's training seminars in Des Moines. He was not a bad man. This needs to be said plainly. He was a man doing his job as he understood it, which was to turn the implements business into a profitable enterprise using the tools available to him. His main tool was the contract rental fleet. AgriCorp had invested heavily in modern equipment. 3 John Deere 9500 combines, each one a gleaming cathedral of agricultural engineering, 20-foot grain platforms, hydraulic header height adjustment, cab air conditioning, and fuel tanks large enough to run for hours without stopping. These machines rented by the hour with operators, and they were genuinely faster than anything most farms in the county could afford to own outright. Calvin had spent the winter and spring of 1993 calling on farm families throughout the county, showing them the numbers, explaining how it made more economic sense to rent his crews and equipment during peak harvest windows than to maintain aging machinery of their own. He was, by all measurable metrics, correct. In a normal year, these machines can put down 300 acres a day in good conditions, he told the assembled farmers at the co-op meeting in March. Your worn-out combines, you're looking at 40, 50 acres a day if the weather holds. You do the math. Most of the farmers did the math, and the math was discouraging. 15 years of tight margins, bank loans, and the grinding anxiety of the 1980s farm crisis had done something to the spirit of independent farm ownership in Iowa. A lot of old equipment had been sold off in sheriff's auctions or simply neglected behind barn doors, while the families who owned it made painful decisions about what they could no longer afford to maintain. By the spring of 1993, AgriCorps had harvest contracts with 60% of the farms in the county. Abner had been at the March meeting. He'd sat in the back row, drunk bad coffee from a foam cup, and said nothing. On the way out, Calvin had given him a brochure that showed a green John Deere 9500 rolling through a golden field under a perfect blue sky. Abner put the brochure in his truck and drove home and did not think about it again. He already had his equipment. Spring came wet to Iowa in 1993, which was not unusual by itself. Iowa springs are almost always wet, the land waking up waterlogged from the snow melt, the tile lines running full, the creek bottoms soft and sucking at a man's boots if he walked out too early to check the fence. But by May it was clear that 1993 was something different. The rain came and did not stop the way it was supposed to. The Mississippi and the Missouri were already running high by April, fed by snowmelt and above-average rainfall from across the entire upper basin, and the tributaries that fed those great rivers were swollen accordingly. Mosquito Creek, which ran along the western edge of the county, rose to within 3 feet of its banks by Memorial Day and stayed there. The old-timers at Millard's talked about it every morning. Herman Schultz, who was 82 and had seen enough Iowa weather to have a considered opinion about all of it, said the river hadn't looked this way since '47, maybe since before the war. Dale Mowry, who farmed the big bottom ground along the creek, said his corn planting was 3 weeks behind because his south fields were still standing water. Walt Gunderson drove past his wheat fields every morning and watched the water level in the low spots, and did his arithmetic, and did not like the answer he kept getting. The winter wheat in Calhoun Bend County had gone in the previous October on the high ground and the rolling middle ground, and it had overwintered well and headed out beautifully in May, a sea of green turning gold as June wore on. On the good ground, the ground that drained properly, that sat on the ridges and the upper slopes, it was a magnificent crop. Heavy heads, good test weight, the kind of wheat that made old-timers smile when they rubbed a handful of kernels between their palms. The county agent said it was as fine a stand as he'd seen in a decade. But the low ground was different. The bottom fields, the creekside acres, the gentle swales where water gathered and lingered, those fields had drained enough to let the wheat grow and head out beautifully. But the soil underneath was saturated in a way that the surface did not fully reveal. You could walk those fields, and the ground felt almost firm enough underfoot, but step wrong and your boot would go down 6 inches into something that wasn't quite soil and wasn't quite water, but was emphatically both. By the 3rd week of June, the wheat was ready. The heads had turned that specific shade of bronze gold that experienced farmers can read like a text, dry enough to cut, protein levels climbing. Every passing day now a day that mattered against the coming weather. And the forecast coming out of Des Moines was not good. There was a system building over Nebraska, a low-pressure area that the meteorologists were describing in careful terms that people in the Midwest had learned, over generations, to translate into plain language. Rain was coming. A lot of it. 3 inches, maybe 5. Coming fast, with thunderstorms. The kind of weather that could flatten ripe wheat and start it sprouting in the head if it sat in wet conditions long enough. Calvin Tremblay had the situation organized. His three big combines would move systematically through the county, starting on the highest and driest ground and working toward the creek bottoms, hitting as many acres as possible before the front moved through. It was a reasonable plan. It was the right plan, in theory. The combines moved in convoy up County Road G, all three of them, like a small green army. You could hear them coming from 2 miles off, that collective roar of engines and fans and cylinder concaves that people who grew up in wheat country carry in their memory, like music. The road shook slightly when they passed, and the air smelled of diesel and grain dust. They worked through June 22nd and 23rd on the high ground, and it went beautifully. 40-acre fields fell in under 2 hours, grain wagons shuttling back and forth to the elevator trucks parked at the field entrances. Calvin stood at the field edges with his clipboard, watching the numbers come in, well satisfied. On the morning of June 24th, they moved to Walt Gunderson's Creek Bottom 40. The first combine made it about 60 feet into the field before it stopped moving forward. The operator of the lead machine, a young fellow named Darren who had been running these combines for AgriCorps for 2 seasons, felt it before he saw it. The machine lurched slightly, the way a boat lurches when it takes a broadside swell. The engine note changed, deepening as the drivetrain suddenly encountered resistance it hadn't expected. He looked back over his shoulder and saw the tracks the machine had made, not the shallow impressions of a machine passing over firm ground, but deep, ragged trenches 12 inches deep, water already seeping in to fill them from below. He lifted the header and backed out carefully, which took the better part of 20 minutes and left a wounded-looking scar in the beautiful wheat. The second combine tried from a different angle and made it perhaps 40 feet before the same thing happened. The third machine, which was heavier because its grain tank was partially full from the morning's run, sank to its rear axle within 30 feet of the field edge and required 2 hours and a rented crawler tractor to extract. Calvin stood at the field edge and looked at his 3 machines and the torn wheat and the standing water beginning to pool in the tire tracks, and he did the arithmetic the situation required. These combines weighed 11 tons empty and close to 15 tons with a full grain tank. All of that weight pressed down onto 4 rear-drive tires, generating a ground pressure that perfectly competent land simply could not bear when it was saturated through. No conventional combine could work in those conditions. It wasn't a question of operator skill or machine quality. It was physics, and physics had spoken. He called his regional director in Des Moines, described the situation, and received a response that was pragmatic and unkind. Not worth the equipment damage. Write off the low-ground crop. Document the conditions. Move on. At Millard's the next morning, Calvin stood and told the 20 farmers packed into the diner, standing along the walls, sitting on windowsills, that AgriCorps would not be attempting the bottom ground fields. The risk of equipment damage was too high. He was sorry. He understood this was a significant loss. The room was very quiet for a moment. Walt Gunderson, who was 68 years old and whose family had farmed that creek bottom ground since 1908, stared at his coffee cup for a long time without speaking. Dale Mowry looked out the window at the empty street. Herman Schultz, who had seen the Depression and knew exactly what crop losses looked like in human terms, simply closed his eyes. It was Abner who spoke, and what he said was quiet and perfectly unremarkable in its simplicity. "I'll see what I can do." Calvin turned to look at him. "Abner, with respect, there's nothing conventional that's going to work in those conditions. The ground can't support anything heavy enough to." "I'll see what I can do," Abner said again, and he put $2 on the table for his coffee and walked out. The machine shed on Abner's farm was 140 feet long, built of corrugated steel on a timber frame, the metal gone rust-red over the decades in a way that was less decay than it was simply color. The natural patina of iron through an Iowa winter repeated enough times. 2 of the 3 big doors faced east, and in the morning the low sun came in at an angle that turned the dust motes into gold. The old combine sat at the far end of the shed, where it had been sitting since 1974, which was the last year Earl had run it. Earl had died in 1981, and Abner had done what you do when a parent leaves, kept what mattered, sorted through what remained, and let time do its slow work on the things he wasn't quite ready to address. The old machine had accumulated 19 years of the shed's particular archaeology, boxes of spare parts stacked on the platform, a canvas tarp that had slowly collapsed over the cutting header, years of dust that had settled into every horizontal surface and changed the machine's color from its original red and silver to the uniform gray of a long sleep. It had been a John Deere 55 self-propelled combine when it left the Harvester Works in East Moline, Illinois, in 1952. 12-foot grain platform, a 4-cylinder gasoline engine that produced about 70 horsepower, an operator's station open to the air in the fashion of the era, and instruments that were simple gauges and levers rather than anything electronic. In its factory configuration, it had been a fine machine for its time, representative of the best technology of the early post-war era, the kind of equipment that had replaced the horse-drawn binders and stationary threshers of the previous generation the way a clear day replaces fog. But Earl Krause had not left it in its factory configuration. In 1957 and 1958, Earl had done a thing that nobody asked him to do and that most people, when they saw it, regarded as either brilliant or insane, depending on their general disposition toward unconventional ideas. He had stripped the rear drive assembly, the 2 large drive wheels that propelled the machine through the field, and replaced them with a pair of track bogies sourced from decommissioned military half-track vehicles. Army surplus lots after the Korean War had been selling this equipment for next to nothing, and Earl, who had grown up watching Caterpillar crawlers work the Iowa gumbo, and who understood tracked machinery from his service in the Pacific, had recognized in those war surplus parts a solution to a problem that Iowa creek bottom farming presented in every wet year the land had the nerve to deliver. The original drive sprockets had been machined to accept the modified track drive, a job Earl had done himself over 2 winters with a metal lathe he'd bought secondhand from a closed machine shop in Iowa City. The front caster wheels, which on the original machine handled steering, had been replaced with wider balloon-style flotation assemblies of Earl's own fabrication. The overall weight of the modified machine, fully set up to harvest wheat, came to approximately 8,000 pounds, and that weight now rode on tracks rather than tires, spreading itself across a footprint that reduced the ground pressure to something under 4 pounds per square inch. Less pressure per square inch than a walking man, less than a horse. The modification was, in purely engineering terms, elegant, but it was also slow. The track drive could not safely exceed about 3 miles per hour without the track assemblies wanting to throw themselves off their bogies, and the additional mechanical friction meant the engine worked hard for every foot of forward progress. Where a modern machine could put down 300 acres in a long day, Earl's creation would struggle to do 40 in ideal conditions, less in difficult ground. In the dry years, and Iowa had many of those in the 60s and 70s, nobody much cared. The neighbors finished while Earl was still going, and they were polite enough not to mention it too loudly. In wet years the machine earned its eccentricity, but those wet years were never quite wet enough, never quite calamitous enough, to fully vindicate what Earl had built. There was always some other way through. There was always enough dry ground, enough time, enough ordinary luck. Abner knew this machine the way you know the tools of a childhood. He had ridden on the platform beside his father from the time he was old enough to hold on, had learned the sounds the engine made when it was working right and when it was not, had spent summer Saturdays handing Earl tools as the big man worked through his maintenance schedule with the methodical patience of someone who understood that machines, like crops, require tending. When Abner came back from Vietnam, quiet, watchful, with that particular stillness of a man who had spent 14 months deciding which silences were safe, he had picked up a wrench and gone out to the machine shed and found something close to peace in the work there. Not happiness exactly. Something older and quieter than happiness. He pulled the tarp off the header first. The canvas came away in a billow of gray dust, and the smell rose up that any farmer knows without needing to name. Old grain chaff, machine oil, the specific mustiness of iron that has been sleeping in a closed space for a long time. The cutting bar was rusted but intact. Several reel fingers were bent or broken, casualties of the years, but the reel itself was sound. He worked through that afternoon and into the evening. He pulled all 4 spark plugs and held them to the shop light, and set them on a clean rack. He drained the old gasoline from the fuel tank, which had turned varnish yellow with age and would have destroyed the carburetor float bowl if he'd tried to run it through. He cleaned the fuel filter, traced the fuel lines for cracks, and found one near the sediment bowl, replaced it with a length of fresh rubber line from his parts shelf. He checked the float needle in the carburetor and found it stuck, freed it with careful patience and a small brass pick. He checked the engine oil, dark but not terrible, and added 2 quarts of fresh 30 weight. He hooked the battery up to his shop charger, a process he started early because he knew a battery sitting 19 years was going to take the better part of the night to decide whether it wanted to live again. He went inside for supper at 8 o'clock. Fried eggs and bread and black coffee, the bachelor farmer's liturgy. The radio in the kitchen was tuned to the Des Moines station, and the evening weather report confirmed what the morning sky had already told him. The front was moving faster than predicted. Possibly 2 days, the meteorologist said. Possibly considerably less. 4 to 6 inches of rain behind it, maybe more. The Missouri River was already at flood stage at Sioux City, which meant that everything upstream was running full and looking for room it would not find. He went back to the shed. At 11 o'clock that night, with the battery showing a full charge, Abner climbed into the open operator's seat, set the choke to full rich, advanced the throttle to the start position, and pressed the starter button. The engine turned over slowly, too slowly, the cold oil thick and reluctant in the cylinders after 19 years of rest. Then it caught on a cloud of blue-white smoke that rolled through the shed and out through the gap under the east door in a visible wave. He held the choke and let it run rough for a full 30 seconds, then eased the choke back as the engine found its temperature. The old 4-cylinders settled into its rhythm, a sound like no modern machine makes, a deep and mechanical heartbeat that had nothing digital about it, nothing processed or filtered, just iron and fuel and fire working out their ancient and reliable bargain. He listened to it for a long time. The engine had a slight miss on the number 3 cylinder, which he noted and decided was tolerable given the circumstances. The generator light on the dash went dark, which was correct. The oil pressure gauge, a simple board-and-tube instrument with nothing electronic standing between it and the oil, climbed to a steady reading in the green range. The combine, after 19 years of quiet, was alive again. He drove it out of the shed just past midnight. The night air was warm and heavy, the way late June air in Iowa can feel, thick with humidity, carrying the smell of rain that was still hours away, but unquestionably coming. The sky was overcast and starless, with a distant flickering on the western horizon that was not quite lightning yet, but was clearly practicing. He called Walt Gunderson from the kitchen before he left, the old rotary phone on the wall beside the refrigerator, a phone that had been there since Kennedy was in office. Walt. Abner. A pause. It's past midnight. I know. You want me to try those bottom fields. Silence on the line. Then how? With Earl's machine. Another silence, longer. I thought that thing hadn't run in 20 years. 19. It runs now. He could hear Walt breathing carefully on the other end. Walt was 68 and had probably been sitting in his kitchen in his robe with the light on, the way farm people sit when sleep won't come and the worries are too large for the dark. Abner, Walt said finally. You know Calvin said nothing could work in those conditions. Calvin said his machines couldn't work in those conditions. He was right about that. He was talking about his machines. Silence. The wheat's worth taking a chance on, Abner said. Yes, Walt said. It is. Come ahead. He reached Walt's fields at midnight, the old combine moving down the county road at a walking pace, its header folded up, its amber lights burning in the darkness. Dale Mowry heard the machine pass his farmyard and came out on his porch to watch, recognizing that whatever machine made that particular sound was not from this decade, or the one before it. He called his neighbor Jim, who called his son-in-law, and word moved through the rural phone network the way it always had in Calhoun Bend, from household to household, carried on voices hushed with something between disbelief and a specific fragile quality of hope. Walt was standing at the field edge with a flashlight and his son Danny, who had driven over from his place 3 miles away when his father called. They watched the old machine come down the road in the darkness and turn into the field approach. Walt held the flashlight steady on the tracks as Abner brought the header down to cutting height. The machine entered the field. It did not stop. The tracks, those wide, flat military track assemblies that Earl Krause had fitted over 2 winters of careful work in 1957 and 1958, spread the machine's weight across a footprint that made the saturated soil irrelevant. Where the Agri-Corps combines had sunk immediately, pressing 11 tons down onto 4 tire contact patches, The old machine rested on the ground like a snowshoe rests on snow, distributing its modest load across the full length and width of its track contact. The ground gave slightly under it. You could see the surface compress and the wheat stubble press down and spring back as the tracks passed, but it did not give way. The machine moved forward at its steady 3-mile-per-hour pace, constant as a clock. The 12-foot header bit into the standing wheat. The grain went up the elevator into the cylinder concave, was threshed and separated and carried into the grain tank with a sound like a distant river, that continuous hiss and rattle of a combine working at capacity that is one of the most beautiful sounds in agriculture when everything is going the way it should be going. Walt Gunderson, standing at the field edge in the darkness, took his cap off and held it against his chest. Danny said very quietly, "My God." Abner kept going. The rhythm of it was the same rhythm it had always been. The straight run down the field, the slow, careful turn at the end, slower yet with the track steering, requiring patience he had plenty of, the parallel return pass. 12 feet of wheat falling per pass, the golden grain mounting in the tank. Every 40 minutes or so, he stopped to let Walt's auger wagon pull alongside and empty the tank, a process that took 5 minutes and required no more technology than a hydraulic auger and a practiced hand on the wagon controls. By 2 in the morning, the lightning to the west was no longer distant. It was specific, branching into the horizon in bright white forks, the kind of electrical display that makes experienced men count the seconds between flash and thunder and note the numbers getting smaller. The wind had shifted around from the south to the southwest, carrying that particular smell of rain moving over warm ground. The smell that people in the Midwest have been reading like a calendar for 200 years. Calvin Tremblay arrived in his company pickup at 2:30, called out by someone in the informal network that had been quietly operating since midnight. He got out of his truck and stood at the field edge and watched the old combine make its slow turn at the far end and begin its return pass, and he did not say anything for a long time. The other farmers were there by then. Herman Schultz was sitting in a lawn chair someone had pulled from a pickup bed, wrapped in a blanket though the night was warm, watching with the patience of a man who has seen enough of the world to recognize when something worth witnessing is happening. Calvin stood apart from the others, his polo shirt damp with the heavy air, his clipboard tucked under his arm. "How long has he been out there?" Calvin asked Dale Mowry. "Going on 3 hours," Dale said. Calvin watched the machine work, and you could see the calculation going on behind his eyes, the rate of progress, the acreage remaining, the time before the storm arrived. "He won't finish in time," Calvin said quietly. "He's doing what he can," Dale said. The combine came back on another pass, the grain tank filling again, dust rising in the beam of the work lights like a golden haze. Abner did not look at the men gathered at the field edge. He looked at the wheat ahead of him and the sky to the west, and he looked at the fuel gauge, which was showing a quarter tank and would need attention within the hour. Calvin watched for another few minutes, and then something shifted in his expression, something that was not quite shame and not quite admiration, but contained elements of both. He walked back to his pickup and spent 10 minutes on the CB radio, talking to his drivers. Then he walked over to Walt Gunderson. "Walt," he said, "I can't get the combines in there, but I've got grain wagons and drivers available tonight. If Abner fills the tank, I can have a wagon alongside every time he's ready to unload. And I've got headlights on those wagons. If more light helps, I'll put every wagon I've got on the field edges." Walt looked at Calvin for a moment with an expression that was hard to read precisely, but was not unkind. Then he nodded. "That'd be a help," he said. The wagons arrived within the hour, their headlights turning the dark field into a theater of gold and long shadow. The rhythm quickened. The acreage climbed. Dale Mowry started calling the progress to the group. 15 acres, 22 acres, 31. And somewhere around 3 in the morning, someone pulled a thermos of coffee out of a truck cab, and it went around the group and came back empty and was refilled from another thermos, because this was Iowa, and people prepared for the long version of things as a matter of course. The thunder was close now. The lightning came in broad sheets rather than individual bolts, illuminating the whole sky for 2 or 3 seconds at a time and showing the clouds above as a massive shelf of darkness stretching from one edge of the visible world to the other. The wind picked up in earnest. The standing wheat in the uncut sections shivered in the gusts, the heavy heads swaying in a way that would have been beautiful in other circumstances. Abner kept going. He had not stopped since midnight except to refuel a 5-gallon can he'd brought in the bed of his truck, which Danny had poured into the tank while Abner kept the engine running and the header up. He had not eaten. He drank water from a mason jar wedged in the seat beside him, the way his father had always done. He was 61 years old, and he had been awake for 20 hours, and the work was not finished, but it was nearly finished, and he knew the difference between those two things in a way that kept him straight in the seat. Walt's 40 acres was done. Dale Mowry's 36 acres was done. He was working Jim Strickland's bottom ground, 22 acres split by a drainage ditch, and there were perhaps 8 acres remaining when the first real rain arrived. Not the tentative scattered drops of a storm's advance, but the wall of water that a genuine Midwest frontal system delivers, vertical and dense and purposeful, the kind of rain that arrives with the complete confidence of something that has been building for a long time. The other men ran for their trucks. The headlights on the wagons became halos of diffused light in the downpour, and the sound of the storm on sheet metal truck cabs drowned out nearly everything else. Nearly. You could still hear the old combine working. Abner had the header down and the cylinder running, and there were 8 acres of wheat between him and the end of the job, and he had not come this far to stop for rain. The open operator's station, Earl had never enclosed it. The modifications consuming all the time and money the project allowed left him fully exposed to the weather, and within 2 minutes he was soaked through completely, his canvas jacket and chambray shirt plastered flat against him, rain streaming off the brim of his John Deere cap in a continuous sheet. He could barely see the row ends in the weather, navigating by the feel of the header working and the sound of grain going up the elevator, running by the accumulated instincts of a man who had driven this machine beside his father in conditions not entirely different when he was 15 years old, and the world had been a different kind of hard. The grain was still good. The heads had not yet absorbed enough rain to matter. He was in the race by minutes, which is how harvests are won. He finished Jim Strickland's second field at 4:57 in the morning, by the clock on the combine's dashboard, one of the few original instruments Earl had kept from the factory machine. He lifted the header and shut down the cylinder and sat there in the rain for a moment, just a moment, listening to the engine idle and the rain drum on the grain tank cover, and the storm work itself out on the Iowa landscape the way it would have worked itself out whether he was here or not. Then he climbed down off the platform into standing water that was already ankle-deep in the low spots of the field. Walt Gunderson was there at the field edge, under a canvas umbrella, the rain drumming on the stretched fabric. He was 68 years old, and the crop was in, and the storm was here in its full force, and his grandfather had broken this creek-bottom ground in 1908 with a team of draft horses and a walking plow, and the numbers that this wheat represented were the kind of numbers that kept the farm going through another year, or didn't. He put out his hand. Abner shook it. "Your daddy built that right," Walt said. "He built a lot of things right," Abner said. The Great Flood of 1993 came down on the American Midwest with a force that would be reckoned with for decades afterward. The Mississippi River crested at levels that broke records going back generations. Towns built on bottomland were inundated. Hundreds of thousands of acres of corn and soybeans went underwater that summer and never came back in any harvestable form. It was the worst natural disaster the region had endured in living memory, and its effects, economic, physical, emotional, took years to fully account. But the winter wheat on Walt Gunderson's Creek Bottom 40, and Dale Mowry's 36 acres, and Jim Strickland's bottom fields, and the 6 other low-ground parcels that Abner worked in the 3 days following, moving from farm to farm as the weather allowed brief windows between rain events. That wheat made it to the elevator. All of it. 216 acres of bottom-ground wheat that the modern machines could not touch, taken by a 61-year-old man on a 19-year idle machine that his Marine father had built in an Iowa winter from other men's war surplus parts and 2 seasons of careful, unhurried work at a second-hand metal lathe. Calvin Tremblay was at the elevator when the last load came in. He stood beside his company truck and watched the auger wagon drain its wheat into the pit, and then he walked over to where Abner was idling the old combine down and preparing to drive it home. "I owe you an apology," Calvin said. He was not a man who said that easily. You could tell by the way the words cost him something. Abner looked at him for a moment. "You didn't know what you didn't know," he said. "That's not a sin." "I said things about this machine," Calvin said. At the co-op meeting last winter, when Herman Schultz mentioned your father's combine, I know what you said, Abner told him, without heat. It didn't change anything. He drove the old combine home in the early morning light, moving at walking pace down the county road, the machine dripping with 2 days of accumulated moisture, the grain tank empty, the header folded up. He was in no hurry. The F-250 followed behind him. Walt's son Danny had offered to drive it back, so Abner wouldn't have to walk. And the morning was quiet and washed clean the way mornings are after hard rain. The kind of morning that makes the green things look impossibly green, and the sky look like it has been repainted from scratch with better materials. He put the old combine back in its place at the far end of the machine shed. He checked the engine oil and added a quart. He greased the points that had been working hardest over the past 3 nights, working the grease gun with steady and unhurried strokes. He ran clean fuel through the system to displace any moisture that had found its way into the carburetor during the open cab work in the downpour. He stood there for a while in the quiet of the shed, with the smell of oil and old grain and warm metal settling around him, and he thought about Earl. Not the way you think about someone with grief after enough years have passed, but the way you think about someone with a particular kind of recognition, the acknowledgement that a life made sense, that the things a person built and the choices a person made had traveled forward in time and proved themselves out in conditions that the builder could not have foreseen but had, perhaps, since were possible. That is the gift some fathers leave, and it is not a small one. Earl had built for the bad years. He had understood, in the way that the generation which survived the Depression and the war understood things in their bones rather than just their heads, that the good years were a gift and the bad years were inevitable, and the job of a careful person was to be ready for both. He hadn't built the track combine because he expected to need it every season. He'd built it because he knew that someday, some wet, impossible, desperate season, someone standing at a creek-bottom field with good wheat and no way to reach it would need exactly this thing, and it should be there. In 1993, that someday arrived. Herman Schultz told the story at Millard's Diner for years afterward. He told it the way old men tell the stories that mean the most to them, slowly, with digressions, with attention to the particular details that other tellings might leave out. He told it to his grandchildren when they came to visit in the summers. He told it to anyone who sat still long enough to hear it out. You have to understand what it looked like, Herman would say, settling back in his chair with his coffee held in both hands. 3 o'clock in the morning. The lightning coming across the western sky like it meant business. The rain just starting at the edge of things. All those men standing there in the dark, not knowing if it was going to work. And that old machine just going. Just steadily going. Back and forth, patient as the land itself. He would shake his head slowly. Abner's daddy built that machine in 1957, he'd say. 36 years before the night it was needed most. And Abner kept it going for 36 years because it was his father's work and it deserved to run. A pause. That's something, isn't it? That's really something. The people who were there that night, all 11 of them, counting the wagon drivers, counting Calvin who had stayed after he'd done what he could, never quite forgot what it was like to stand in an Iowa field at 3 in the morning and watch a machine from another era do what the modern world had already decided was impossible. There was something in it that was difficult to name precisely. It was not just practical triumph, though it was that. It was not just the satisfaction of old knowledge vindicating itself against newer certainties, though it was that too. It was something about the nature of preparation, about the quiet, stubborn wisdom of keeping things that the efficient world declares obsolete. It was about the slow and unglamorous and largely invisible work of maintenance, the grease gun and the clean rag, the hour in the shop with a worn part, the refusal to let something die simply because something newer had come along to replace it. It was about an understanding that is not fashionable, not easily explained to a man with a business degree and a rate schedule, that the land has always asked more of us than the good years reveal, and that the true measure of a farmer is not taken in the easy seasons, when everything grows right and the equipment runs and the sun cooperates, but in the moment when the sky is the wrong color and the ground is giving way and everything you were told to count on has already sunk to its axle in someone else's field. Abner Kraus kept the old combine in his shed for the rest of his life. He ran it once more, in the wet spring of 1999, when the creek bottoms again defied the modern fleet, and again the wheat came out when nothing else could reach it. After that, the good years ran together in the way good years tend to do, and the machine rested. But it was never again covered with the canvas tarp. That tarp stayed folded on the shelf above the workbench where Abner had left it, and the old John Deere sat in its corner of the shed with the header down and the engine ready, the way Earl had always intended it to be ready. Just in case, because the land does not care what year it is, or what the new equipment costs per hour, or what any careful man with a clipboard has calculated about acceptable risk. The land is older than all of that. It has been wet before and will be wet again. And the people who understood it best were always the ones who had learned to prepare not for the years that were likely, but for the years that were possible. Earl Krause had known this. His son knew it too. And in the small hours of a June morning in 1993, with the lightning walking in from Nebraska and the rain beginning its long arrival, and the wheat still standing in the creek bottoms waiting for someone willing to go get it, that knowledge was worth more than any man had a right to calculate.